Have you ever been in a situation where you have received goods from a supplier, but some of the goods were not up to scratch? Or have you ever sent an invoice to a customer, but because you accidentally undercharged them, you need to ask for more money? Situations like this happen sometimes in business, and when they do, customers and suppliers can use debit notes to sort things out. So in this video, we're going to take a look at a few situations in which debit notes are used to fix problems that happen between suppliers and their customers. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at what a debit note actually is. A debit note is a document that is part of the purchasing process, along with other documents such as quotes and invoices. They are issued by either the supplier or the customer when one of the parties needs to make a debit entry into their accounts because something has gone wrong during the purchasing process. With that in mind, let's take a look at the two most common scenarios in which debit notes are issued. In the first scenario, the customer will issue the debit note, and in the second scenario, the supplier will issue the debit note. Okay, so in the first scenario, a customer has purchased some goods from a supplier. An invoice will be sent from the supplier to the customer at a later date, after the customer receives and checks the goods. Upon checking the goods, the customer notices that some of the items are faulty and need to be returned to the supplier. Because some of the goods are being returned, the customer needs to request an amendment to the invoice equal to the value of the goods being returned. To do this, the customer will create a debit note on their accounting system and send it to the supplier. The supplier will then create a credit note in their accounting system and apply it to the invoice they're going to send to the customer. This will effectively reduce the total amount payable on the invoice, so the customer only pays for the goods that are not faulty. For example, if $1,000 of goods was delivered, but $200 of these goods were faulty, the customer would send the faulty goods back to the supplier along with a debit note of $200. The supplier would then create a $200 credit note on their accounting system and apply it to the invoice for this sale. The supplier will send an invoice to the customer with a total amount payable of $800, which is the original $1,000 minus the $200 credit note. It's worth noting that if the credit note could not be applied to the invoice for the current sale for some reason, the customer and supplier could agree to apply it to a future invoice instead. If that was done in this example, the supplier would send an invoice of $1,000 to the customer for this sale and reduce a future invoice by $200. So that's one of the two main scenarios in which debit notes are used, and it involves a debit note being issued by a customer and sent to a supplier. In the second scenario we're going to look at, the supplier will issue the debit note and send it to the customer. This usually happens when the supplier undercharges their customer by accidentally sending them an invoice for a lower amount than they should have. In this case, the supplier will create a debit on their accounting system and send it to the customer as a debit note. The customer will then either add the debit note to the incorrect invoice and pay the total amount, or they will make separate payments for the debit note and the invoice. For example, if a supplier was supposed to send an invoice of $500 to a customer, but they accidentally sent an invoice for only $450, the supplier could then create a debit note of $50 and send it to the customer. The customer would then add the debit note to the outstanding invoice and pay the supplier $500, which is made up of the $450 invoice plus the $50 debit note. It's worth noting that if the debit note could not be applied to the invoice for the current sale for some reason, the supplier could agree that the customer can pay for the $50 debit note separately or add it to a future invoice. So there you have it. That's the two main reasons why debit notes are used in the purchasing process. Number one, to adjust an invoice when faulty goods need to be returned to a supplier, and number two, to ask for more money when a supplier undercharges a customer. At this point, you may be wondering why you would use debit notes at all, instead of just deleting any incorrect invoices and sending out amended ones? Well, this is because businesses are usually required to keep an accurate audit trail of their transactions. If you receive faulty goods from a supplier and you delete the invoice they send you because you aren't going to pay the full amount, that may leave you with no evidence on record that you received the faulty goods, and you may need that evidence if there is a dispute. A better idea is to keep the original invoice, send a debit note, and then keep both documents together in your system. That way you have a proper audit trail of the events that happened during the transaction. And one last thing about debit notes, and that is to make sure they contain lots of information about the supplier, the customer, and the transaction. A good rule of thumb is to include similar information on your debit notes that you include on your invoices, such as business names, address and contact details, descriptions, quantities and prices of goods and services, and relevant tax amounts such as GST or VAT. The more information you include, the better your audit trail will be. So that's it for debit notes, and as you can see, they can be created for a variety of reasons, they can be for any amount, and there is flexibility with how they are applied to current and future invoices. If you would like to learn more about the purchasing process, check out our videos on credit notes, invoices, quotes, and other related topics.